So help us think a little bit more about the way in which sort of minstrelly in its form, its performance form, is not dead, but it is slowly disappearing because there are other performance forms. But we have a person in Macon, Emmett Miller, who is kind of at the end of that moment, not completely, but at the end of that moment. But we're also going to get the blues are going to come in at play at the same time. What role does Miller play in any of that? And how is he shaping the music as we kind of move into a new form, even as his performance form is largely disappearing?
Well, what's interesting about Miller, I'll mention this in passing. I picked up a copy of the Minstrel Man from Georgia, which is the Sony Legacy CD featuring Miller's performances. And when I saw the cover of it, like most people, I was kind of scared to approach it because it's he's in blackface, and I didn't know how to take that. Being a fan of the series and having listened to like Blind Willie McTell and any number of blues performers on the same Roots to Blues series, I wanted to complete my set of music. Then I read on the back that he performed the Lovesick Blues, which had also been performed by Hank Williams, and it was actually one of Hank Williams' most well-known numbers in many ways. So that intrigued me to pick up the CD, and I was absolutely astonished to see the mixture of musical styles. So just to kind of continue on our conversation in the previous question, so 1928 is when Miller begins recording for Ralph Peer, who was the A&R man who would bring Mamie Smith into the studio with the Crazy Blues. He would also manage the Carter family, Jimmy Rogers. He worked with Carmen Miranda as well as Hoagie Carmichael and Buddy Holly throughout his career. So he was an A&R man that was recording a lot of different acts. And one of his theories about popular roots music was that people didn't want to just hear folk styles themselves because that was too common in one way. But there needed to be some type of experimentation that needed to go on in addition to the folkloric music. Because he didn't say roots music, he never used that term, but he said familiar music, down-home music, and terms like that, people could, by listening to it, they could hear the regional style. But again, people want to be excited. They want to hear something creative. They want to hear an experimentation. So Ralph Peer used that to his advantage. That's why people like Jimmy Rogers worked with Louisville Jug Band, Luke Jordan, and any number of African-American performers throughout his career. Right. Emmett Miller wasn't as well known, but he was a part of the vaudeville circuit that catered to blackface minstrelsy. Of course, blackface minstrelsy kept until about the mid to late 1960s in many cases. In England, it stayed until the 1980s with the black and white minstrels. So the form stayed somewhat in play. Again, after the Civil Rights era, it became very controversial, and then it just is something that just kind of got wiped out after several decades. But to put Miller into his own context, he was connected to the black vaudeville scene around the Ocmulgee Theater and the Douglas Theater. So he was a young white kid that was hanging around these places, hearing the black vaudeville performers. And then he began to take on those styles. And the style of the day was blackface minstrelsy. So everybody corked up. So there was, in one way, to be on stage, you had to do this art form. And there was no way to get around this in one way. But when he made his records, at first he was performing like any other vaudevillian, which is a piano. And there are several early records where Emmett Miller is singing just with piano accompaniment. But when they decided to expand his recordings with a bigger band, they featured the Dorsey Brothers, who again had a very elaborate career in jazz, Eddie Lang, Gene Krupa was on many of those early cuts as well. So for jazz fans, it's also an entree into what some of the white jazz artists who would become big in the swing era, what they were doing in their early days when they were just session guys in the background. So with Miller, it's very interesting in a way that the song material he chose, they really struck a chord in popular music in such a way that country and western artists of the 1940s and 50s would record Miller's songs because in some ways they heard the records. Country and western has a comedy faction that was built on minstrelsy, but then of course they changed it and they just blackened out the teeth instead of the face in some ways, you know. And so there was an aspect of this minstrel comedy amongst a lot of the early country and music, and of course with hillbillies, another controversial name, the hillbilly performers. There was a certain set of comedians that were around that did blackface but then transitioned over into more of the hillbilly stereotype. And so Miller fits in this realm. Before being the hillbilly stereotype, he was a blackface comedian within the theater and show form. So you have, like, every time you listen to any of his records, you have this merging of ragtime, jazz, what we would now call country and western music, but also early blues. And he's not doing like a 12-bar blues like we would think now, but he's doing sort of the more W.C. Handy compositional blues style. And then he became well known for doing a little blues yodel, like a lee. And you can tell from reading about his performance style, he used this to great effect. There's one small movie called Yes Sir, Mr. Bones, where you see Miller performing. He doesn't sing in the film, but he has one little comedy bit where he's the sketch is the guy comes up, his partner says, "Hey, you look like you haven't slept." He says, "Oh man, I haven't slept at all." He said, "What happened?" He said, "Well, there was a cat that was sitting out my window and he just meowed and howled all night long." And so he used these sort of vocal effects to give a sense of excitement in the same way, in some ways, that we hear vocalists using these sort of runs in a way to create excitement and an effect. You know, like any soul singer has a moment where they just start doing big runs and everybody starts going nuts. And you can see that Emmett Miller picked up on that in those early days in the Black Vaudeville Theater, and then he applied that somehow into his act, and that made him quite popular in his day. It's hard for people to be able to take Emmett Miller at face value because his act is not at face value. Blackface minstrelsy it's always been built on masks and deception in a certain type of way because you know, Emmett Miller, the performer, then he turns into Brother Sam when he puts his mask on. When he takes his mask off, he's Emmett Miller again. But who's the real Emmett Miller and who's the real Brother Sam? And so there's a lot of that sort of I guess a multi-layered code switching. You know, this is now physical code switching compared to code switching with language. And so this is also the crux of minstrelsy as we know it. So that's kind of where Emmett Miller fits in the kind of the grand scheme of things. But he's recording in 1928 when, I guess, around the 1870s and the 1880s is when minstrelsy had passed its heyday. So we're thinking like 30 to 40 years after the fact. So the fact that this fellow is even doing his style of entertainment is, one, rare, and then two, that he made records that are referenced back by other musicians 20, 30 years down the line. All of a sudden, Emmett Miller, while as a blackface comedian is an obscurity, as a song performer, he is part of the foundation of an aspect of country and western music. That's quite an essential part of honky tonk, especially like Lefty Frizzell. Also Eddie Arnold recorded his songs. The Light Crust Doughboys, which featured Milton Brown and Bob Wills very early in their careers, they recorded several of Miller's songs. And Miller was also performing songs by Andy Rassif as well. You know, Andy Rassif, the African-American Madagascar songwriter who worked with Fats Waller. So he's not just doing white material performing in blackface, he's also doing African-American compositions in blackface style too. So there's a little bit of that going on as well. It's quite multi-layered. That's one of the reasons that Emmett Miller has had such has had such an effect on American popular music. And then, of course, retrospectively, that's one of the reasons he's so intriguing now.